So thank you. I'm here today with Professor Dexter Gabriel, who also writes under the pseudonym Fenderson Djèlí Clark, and he is the author of Ring Shout, which my students read this semester, along with Bitter Root by Chuck Brown, David Walker, and Sanford Green, and other texts. And today we're just gonna talk about Ring Shout, some of the connections possibly with Bitter Root, but just Ring Shout as a whole. It's a really thick book, even though it's very, very thin. There's a lot there to think about. So thank you for joining me today, Professor Clark.
Thank you for having me, Matt. It's great to talk to you and your students.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this. I've read Ring Shout when I was kind of preparing my syllabus for this year and picked it up, and I think I read like the first chapter or two, and I was like, this goes perfectly well with Bitter Root and other texts that we're reading, especially talking about Tulsa, because Tulsa seems to be a through line with a lot of the texts we're reading this semester and other things too. So thank you for that. And like I said, it's like 160 pages or 150 pages as a novella, but very dense. We started with Ann Petrie's The Street this semester, which is about 350, 400 pages. This thick. I think we've probably gotten a lot more allusions and things pulling out of Ring Shout, that to fit The Street. It's crazy, but awesome. So let's just get going. So one of the central threads that runs throughout Ring Shout is the power of media to inculcate individuals to hate, something we thought about a lot. And the novella focuses on the impact of W.D. Griffin's Birth of a Nation. You can talk about kind of the way it plays in the novel, which led to the resurgence of the Klan in the United States, not just in the South, but also in the Midwest and beyond. And I didn't realize this till I had a job interview in Indiana, the impact of the Klan in Indiana, and it was connected with Birth of a Nation.
Yeah.
So media overall has an impact. And about, 25, give or take years later, my math may be off. In 1939, of course, Gone with the Wind came out. Mm-hmm. So in 1938, 1 year before that adaptation came out, Walter White from the NAACP wrote to the director of Gone with the Wind, David O. Selznick, stating that the motion picture, appealing as it does to both the visual and the auditory senses, reaches so many Americans, particularly of the middle classes, that infinite harm could be done in a critical period like this one, when racial hatred and prejudices are so alive. So can you talk about the role of Birth of a Nation in the novella, the impact of media on one's worldview, and of the importance of having representation, not just film, but also in all forms of media, as of course we saw with the Emmys last night?
Right, which I unfortunately didn't get to see. I can't wait to see who won. Don't tell me. I have to look it up. So thank you. That's a great question. That's a whole class. By the way.
I know.
In fact, I teach a class called Slavery in Film, where we start off just prior to Birth of a Nation. And Birth of a Nation is our first, of course, major film. Before that, we're doing short films. And so we talk about the impact of Birth of a Nation in American society and its long-lasting impact. One of the things we do even before that, we talk a lot about media theory, which I'm sure you're probably doing as well, or you've done. And so we talk a great deal. We ask those questions. What is media's impact on society, right? And we go through the Marshall McLuhan and the other things about medium theory and all of these other things. And so I actually leave this to students to try to understand, right? Because I said we don't have a full answer to this yet. Is it that media impacts us and has this impact upon us? Do we bring things to the various media that we see? How do things change? How does Birth of a Nation's impact when it's a book change from when it becomes a play, and just completely changes when it becomes a film, right? It's the same thing, but how does the different medium that it's within change its impact upon us? And when I say us, who does it impact? Right? African Americans didn't go see Birth of a Nation and come out thinking like, wow, we're now bigots who believe these things. It had an impact upon a certain segment of society. And so we wrestle with these questions, and we ask, we tried to talk about its impact during this time period, how something like the medium of film itself would have blown people away. I tried to say it would be like us going and watching something in virtual reality or a holodeck for the first time. Right? I use a Star Trek holodeck thing, and how we'd be like, this must be real, how people in the movie theaters would faint at certain scenes, or of the great claim of the newspaper article that says the man in Florida pulled out a gun to shoot at one of the white characters in blackface on the screen, right? Because I can't remember if I put that in a ring. I can't remember if that.
I think you did.
Yeah, there might have things survived the edits and a lot of things didn't. So sometimes it's hard to remember what did. But the fact that that came from an actual newspaper article, I said, think about the impact of what seeing this large two-dimensional image with this soundtrack behind it, how much that was so different from people watching things in a theater or reading it in a book, right? And how that simply impact their senses and how they react. And so we talk a great deal about that. And certainly Birth of a Nation offers us so much because of not only its content material, but the period it comes out in 1915, you know, just before the end of World War I and the Red Summer, this heavy era of anti-Black race riots and lynchings and what have you. And then its long-lasting legacy, how it literally helps jumpstart and recreate the Ku Klux Klan. So much so that second Klan bases a lot of its symbolisms on the film. I sometimes call them the movie Klan, right? Which would be funny if they weren't so dangerous.
Yeah.
And how it allows the Klan for the first time to really spread beyond the South and maybe parts of California that have been in Reconstruction, and spread to, as you pointed out, nearly every corner of the United States.
Yeah, I mean,
playing a part in politics and everything else. And so there's this strong importance that we have to think about. And I think when you bring up, I saw in the question, you brought up Walter White, of course, talking about Gone with the Wind. And we watch Gone with the Wind as well. And it's always great when students have seen Birth of a Nation and they can pick out how much the author of Gone with the Wind, Margaret Mitchell, how much she's influenced by Birth of a Nation. Because as a matter of fact, one of my students said, this is Birth of a Nation, but lukewarm.
Yeah.
And I say, in some ways, yes. But as you point out, Walter White actually has this discussion, right, with the producers and what have you, with Gone with the Wind, because he fears it's going to be a repeat of Birth of a Nation, right? So he's thinking Gone with the Wind is going to cause the same stir, right? It's just been, pardon my math, 20-something, 25 years. We're going to have the same problems again. Right. And so he actually goes in, and this allows Gone with the Wind, as bad as people think it is, there he is. As bad as, this is Boston the Barris, right? I mean, Barris
so
the
cute.
Boston, everybody wants to know.
I love it. I love the eyes.
Yeah, he's just there watching. But Walter White actually, gets him to go in and remove some of the more incendiary and racist tropes that are in the book version of Gone with the Wind. And so when you see the movie, that's the watered down version. You have problems with the film, right? And so I think about how they, many ways he was operating off of the dangers he saw, the dangers people like Du Bois saw, the dangers people like William Monroe Trotter, who's fighting against Birth of a Nation. Those issues that had been seen 25 years later, he's thinking it's going to come about now. And it's very important if the NAACP inserts itself and tries to find a way to manage those representations.
Well, like you said, this could be a whole course, because when you started talking about Gone with the Wind, I started thinking something else too. And there's a couple of things you said that really stood out to me. One thing that I actually just thought about is too, that Gone with the Wind comes out right before we enter World War II.
Yes.
So we have that same connection with Birth of a Nation. We enter World War I in 18. That's like 3 years before. And World War II starts in 39 when Gone with the Wind comes out. And we enter in 41, of course. The other thing I thought about too is the fact that the African-American movie directors, Oscar Micheaux, of course, is the most famous one that we know about. Where do we talk about them within this kind of context too? But with Gone with the Wind, this kind of comes back to something else you said. You mentioned that what do we bring to the media that we see or the medium that we read, right? And with Gone with the Wind, one of the things that really gets me, I can say I haven't watched the whole thing, and I haven't watched Birth of a Nation, just seen clips on what I've read. But there are authors who were pushing back against that trope in Gone with the Wind. That book came out, I think, in 36. And Frank Yerby's the big author I think about. I do work on Frank Yerby. He's from Augusta. He started writing social protest literature, but then when he couldn't get his social protest novels published, he moved to what he called costume romances. I don't know if you know anything about Frank Yerby, but he moved these costume romances. And his first novel was 1946, The Fox is a Hero, which is basically Gone with the Wind, but having more, while it focuses on a white Irish immigrant, Stephen Fox, and him coming to New Orleans, coming to Louisiana, building his plantation, building his wealth, and then losing it in the war. And then kind of right at the start of Reconstruction, if you really look at the novel, it's a focus on the enslaved. I kind of view that novel kind of as them as the center.
Right.
He was the first Black author to have his book optioned off for a film in 46, I think for $250,000, which, you know, at the time.
Yeah.
And The Fox is a Hero, the adaptation came out in 47. So immediately after the war too. And they basically gutted everything that would have made that book, that makes that book subversive. Right.
Right.
So a couple of things there is, one, the way that media changes things with the adaptations, but also the way that white readers took Yerby, didn't realize he was Black until later, unless they knew that Fisk and Payne were HBCUs, because he could pass if you see a picture of him.
Much like Walter White.
Exactly. I mean, Walter White did, of course, when he went and, you know, investigated lynchings. I mentioned this to my students the other day, but if you want a good, not historical fiction, but based off of Walter White, Matt Johnson and Warren Pleece's Incognito, that graphic novel is like really good. But the way that, you know, readers take the medium and bring their own things to them. I was thinking about the Boondocks there too. Because I watched the Boondocks, you know, when I was younger, when it came out. And then looking back, and I'm like, these are the things that me not knowing some of these things would have taken something else with it, right? Or me listening to like Dr. Dre, you know, that type of stuff. Like, what do I bring to it? And one of the stories I think about too is I used to work at the Ernest Gaines Center. Now, I don't know if you've read his novel, Lesson Before Dying, or you know. Yeah. So one of the things in the center, there was a letter from, I think, a lawyer in Jacksonville or whatever. So he read A Lesson Before Dying. And I think in the letter, the gist of it was, you know, I've never thought about these things. I've done these things, and I'm at the point now where I can sit in the mall while my wife's shopping and talk to a Black guy about the Jacksonville Jaguars or something. I'm like, I think you missed the whole kind of point of this book. I think that's really important to think about. There's a lot we just said there, I know, but it all kind of plays in.
No, I think first of all, some of the things you brought up, I think the timing of both of these films, you know, with World War I, for instance, and the end of World War I, I think that I can imagine Walter White is looking at the march of fascism. And you talk about people who are anti this thing. There were Black anti-fascists, right? There were strong Black anti-fascists who traveled to Spain. Some who wanted to, you know, to fight against Franco there. Others who were rallying to go to Ethiopia's defense to fight against Mussolini. And so, you know, so you can imagine one of the appeals Walter White makes is the understanding that the United States is going to be involved in this war sooner or later. And we're watching the march of fascism here. And, you know, the U.S. doesn't need turmoil. And pardon me, there are fascists in the United States who are having huge rallies and other things, right? And I'm thinking of course, Roth's, not It Could Happen Here, I always forget his version of a Nazi, of a fascist leader coming to power in the United States.
Yeah, it was just a limited series on HBO, which I haven't watched.
Yeah, I can't remember the name now, but you know, Walter White is watching all of these things, and you know, this is the appeal he makes. Like, you want a calm society. So it's interesting that I think, as you point out, before that, they don't want too much turmoil. And certainly after the war, right, when Yerby's adaptation comes out, they don't want turmoil then either, because we're entering we need to be calm now and everything needs to be.
There's two things you said there that really stick out. And I haven't thought about that, because one of the things I'm just now looking into, fingers crossed, we have a study travel trip scheduled for Poland. To actually look at the Holocaust. And one of the things that I really want to drive home with students on that trip is the connections with Nazi Germany and fascism and the United States, specifically the United States South. And where Hitler and his crew basically got a lot of their ideas were from the Jim Crow South. If you look at kind of the Nuremberg laws and everything.
Wrote people there to find out about eugenics, or in California. Things like eugenics.
And he mentioned, I was looking at something too, he mentioned that Gone with the Wind was one of his favorite books or movies, basically. And he said that, you know, the Civil War, the South shouldn't have lost it or something. The South losing it was bad. It's kind of, I'm like, all of this is kind of playing out within this thing. And then, like you said, there were Nazi parties here, I think, to the 1939 Madison Square Garden event with like 20,000 people. But the other thing you mentioned too, I think that's important, with the Yerby film is the film. Yerby has his issues. I mean, he has his sexism, he has his misogynistic issues,
Mhm.
but the film very much places it back within, this is men's roles, this is women's roles after the war, this is blacks roles, right?
Mhm.
That the war and the industries that have started and women going in the workforce, the Great Migration,
Yeah, that's
continuing
all
with,
over now.
yeah,
White men are returning as they see it.
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
That's all over that film, and the
Yeah.
book doesn't really deal with that.
Hmm.
So that's just a side. That's kind of
Yeah.
side thing.
So yeah, but I think one thing is important that's there, and I think it goes back to even how we started this off is that, and you brought up Oscar Michaud and others. There's always a resistance to
Mhm.
this, right? These things don't simply, whether it's Gone with the Wind. Look at the protests against Gone with the Wind, right? There were African Americans who
Right.
go to African American newspapers who are heavily critical of it, right? Their voices aren't as heard, right? Or they aren't as magnified. But you have with Birth of a Nation, especially, they're huge protests, right? African Americans like Trotter and others are picketing outside movie theaters. They are trying to get, and they sometimes succeed, by the way, in getting the film not to be bought. And ironically, in certain places like the Midwest, ban the film, like places like Kansas, but ban the film because they say it's going to cause too much unrest, right? And so they're actually successful in some places and not. And they're so successful, they actually get D.W. Griffith to take parts out of his films that were
Oh
even
wow.
worse. The part at the end, supposedly, where the showing what paradise would be all of the African Americans getting sent back to Africa
Oh,
in ships, right? They get him, and so they even get him to take out some. And so, there's great work because often it's seen as, well, they failed, the film went out, but they actually did have this impact. And the whole point, as you point out, they were there. That Oscar Michaud does, in fact, make a film that's supposed to rebuttal to Birth of a Nation, right? And its ideas, even though he bases it on something a little different, it's still on the ideas and ideals of it. And so it's always important to remember there's resistance, and partly that's what Ring Shout is based upon, right? That there's always going to be resistance to this kind of thing. And they deal with the fact of trying, their resistance is much more supernatural and physical, but they deal with this type of resistance to this film. And, they wrestle as well with the impact of the film on people. I think there's a point when the character Sadie, when, they're saying, well, it has an impact. He said, well, it seems to only have an impact on white folks, right? And so that's the question there when you said, what do you bring? Obviously, Birth of a Nation didn't just hit people like inject them, injection theory, and
exactly.
suddenly, oh, I'm
It was
I'm
coming in a
racist.
lost cause
Right.
rhetoric.
Yeah,
It's
they
the
were bringing,
UDC.
they had been, yeah, they had been steeped in lost cause rhetoric and anti-black rhetoric and a lot of the same racism, the global racism. This is the era of colonialism. This is the
Mhm.
era of race science, right? Of craniometrics and everything else you can think of. People have been steeped in these ideas heavily. And so when something like Birth of a Nation, the film, comes along, they simply find, I guess the word we use would be confirmation bias, right? They simply find ways to confirm those beliefs, and it's easier for them to take it on. But they're not meeting blank slates, which is, I
Exactly.
guess, what we try to say. None of us are these blank slates that the movie just comes and writes itself upon. We are bringing things that we already believe to it, and I think we do that with a lot of films.
Well, the one thing you mentioned there too is the resistance that's there, and of course, I don't know the extent of the resistance to most things, Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind included. But one of the things that we're kind of tracing through at least this early half of the semester with my students is a lot of the texts we look at deal with the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Yeah,
And of course, they found out about it specifically within the last year.
yeah,
But these kind of discussions of, and that's not resistance, I know, in the way you're talking about here, but these stories and the history and why the resistance of these pieces isn't what's there, but we're talking about these other things, right? Not
right.
just with these instances, but with others as well. Like I was just learning about Ethiopia's history and the fact that they were never colonized
Yeah.
in the way the other nations were, and
The Battle of
reasons why,
Adwa, which
all that type of
African
stuff.
Americans and Afro Caribbeans actually uphold because the Ethiopians
Right.
defeat the Italian force meant to
Well,
colonize. Yeah.
which makes me think back. I mean, I know that David Walker and everybody were looking back to Ethiopia like in the early
Hmm.
1800s, but why Ethiopia is so upheld? I mean,
Yeah.
it makes
Yeah.
sense,
It's not colonized. Also, allusions of it in the Bible, biblical texts, and ancient
right?
texts. It simply becomes this symbol. And there's that great book, it's Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia, which is a great text to show how if the ideas of Ethiopia become lodged within the Black Pan African ideology, whether if it's romantic or what have you. But it does. But I think, yeah, there's always resistance to these kinds of things. And I think it's interesting you bring up Tulsa, because I think like Tulsa is something that I've always known of. Like at least I can remember when I was small, and I can tell you I can't remember where. It was simply something that rode along Black networks. And so I might have been sitting in a barbershop or something as a kid, and maybe somebody was like, yeah, Tulsa, and they would often say Black Wall Street, right? That was the name they would give. And the facts were always somewhat a little off. Now that I know it, they're like, it was myth mixed in with history, but I knew about it. And this is something because my parents are from the Caribbean, right? And they both like, so we knew about it as Black people. My parents came to the United States like in the 60s, and they learned about it. And so they passed it along to me. And I've noticed along a lot of Black networks, there's always this information along Black networks that's talked about, like, they destroyed that Black town in Tulsa or what have you. But it was interesting that I don't think most of America knew about it until The Watchmen
Yeah, exactly.
came about. And they used it in there, and they said there was like a huge Google search. And it just amazed me at times how we can exist in the same spaces in the United States and share completely two different understandings of reality, right? Where on the one hand, many Black communities know about this, but the larger communities in the US have never heard of it. And now it's getting all of the, I think it's coming up over and over again. And I think sometimes people think, well, it must have come because of Watchmen. And no, you're seeing it in something like in Misha Green's work, in Lovecraft Country, because you have someone who, a white writer who had heard of this, right? He really does a good job of looking at Black experiences. And of course, the Black writers in the room also doing the same.
Right.
And I'm bringing it up for the same reason, right? This is just something that's just always been part of the larger lexicon of my understanding of Americana. And so I've always known that those things existed. And as well, I think you're right. There is a lot of different forms of resistance. There are huge NAACP is going out and doing the huge silent protest marches, right? Down Fifth Avenue in New York, talking about the riots in East St. Louis, right? Pointing out lynching and so forth. And so there's Ida B. Wells, and so there are all types. People are resisting politically. They're doing massive social protests. People like Ida B. Wells are saying one way to resist is if every Black family kept a Winchester rifle in their window. So there's a group called the African Blood Brotherhood that exists in Harlem. That's
there's one. I mean to cut you off, but that made me. Yeah. I forget their name, but they started in Jonesboro, like in the '60s, from where. Yeah. And that's the region where I'm from. I'm from Shreveport Bossier in Louisiana.
Okay.
So like I didn't know about them until recently, right?
Yeah.
So
I grew up in Houston, so I know that I-10, that whole I-10 corridor.
Oh, I'm talking I-20. I'm north.
You're talking I-20 though, yeah.
I'm talking north.
Further, yeah.
I did go to grad school I-10 area. So I-10, okay. Any food, one of the best memes I've seen recently is any food north of I-10, you got to season really, really good. South of I-10, you're good. Anyway,
that's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah.
But the Tulsa stuff, right? Like I'd heard of Tulsa. I didn't know the story. Like others did. And then, of course, starting to dig into it more. Like, I don't remember when I found out about the Elaine massacre, right? Mm-hmm. You mentioned that in Ring Shout too. The St. Louis one I didn't know about, right?
Yeah, East St. Louis. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So like digging like into all of them. And one of the things that I dug into, that I never learned about is the Bossier massacre, which was 1868. So all the massacres that occurred in Louisiana, specifically during Reconstruction.
Yeah, Colfax, exactly. There's so many. From Reconstruction based on politics. It's like that era has so many, it's like you have to cordon it off in the post-Civil War. The idea the Civil War ends neatly. No, there's killing continues and massacres. Then there's the political massacres, like you point out, that go from the 1860s to the 1870s. Mm-hmm. And then we're starting a whole new batch after the New South fully solidifies itself. And many of them are massacres and they're pogroms, right? Like the best word to use for them is sometimes they're like East St. Louis is, we are not only going to kill people, we're going to push them out and take everything, right?
And that's what happened. I haven't read much about it. That's what happened to, I think in Forsyth County here in Georgia. Mm-hmm. But even like Lake Lanier here, which was, they flooded the black town, Oscarville, right? Mm. I mean, all of this type of stuff. Whenever somebody whenever somebody's injured, or typically whenever somebody passes away on Lake Lanier, like Twitter like pops that up. They're like, it's haunted. I mean, but just those stories are important, especially for everybody, but for me, for you, for everybody, right?
Yeah.
So let's move on to kind of another question too, because you talk about the class that you teach, and I thought about this. So when Dr. Bissett tries to convince Mars to accept, the Grand Cyclops' offer,
yeah,
this is what she thinks to herself. This is my pain, my scar to carry, ain't theirs to feast on, to suck dry like marrow from a bone. I've had enough of monsters devouring bits of me, trying to eat me up altogether. So when I read this, and we were talking about it in class, I think about other moments in the novella, but I also think about the continued presence in media, specifically films, of Black individuals suffering and dying, and just the pain that individuals endure, right? So how does Mars, and I guess the novella, push back against kind of this narrative of, I guess the right word would be the exploitation of Black suffering, within this context, and how others push back against it in their representation?
Yeah,
so Black joy, I guess.
That's a hard one to deal with.
Yeah.
And it pops up a lot of times in social media, especially I think within the last few years, the access to people seeing Black bodies killed by police and simply watching the brutality, or watching bodies simply being left around. People have compared them, made interesting comparisons to lynchings, the spectacle of it, right? And so I fully understand that. And I see people have talked about that, maybe even in film, like they're tired of seeing type of, images of Black bodies and Black people being abused. Even the term bodies, which people have used, like, is that correct to use that term? And it's something, that I'd seen used before. And so people begin questioning these terms, right? Whether you should simply use bodies, and, that you don't dehumanize the person in doing so.
That's a whole nother discussion.
That's
why I chose individuals there too, because I've thought about that, and especially discussions with language. I've talked to my students about this too, of, why we use enslaved instead of slave, right?
Right.
Or enslaved instead of master, but sorry.
No, but yeah, so there are a lot of these questions. I said some of these questions I don't have full answers to, right? And I'm kind of dealing with it there. Like, even I'm a person who studies slavery and emancipation, and I find myself even again enslaved. I go back and forth, and I know why people are using it, and then I will switch and use different ones at times, right? And so
Me too.
I think we have these questions, and I think it's good that we're asking these questions. So when we talk about pain, for instance, I said I study slavery and emancipation. I'm going to see a lot of issues of exploitation and abuse, right? And so I'm often, even as an educator, I have to ask myself, at what point do I get my point across, right? In talking about these things, and when does it trip over into exploitation? And so I had to think of this as an educator when I would show images of lynching, right? And so I took some cues in reading, for instance, about how the Holocaust Museum came about, and how they had to determine what they would show in some of the images. And they were like, do we show images of bodies piled up, which is really horrific? Or is it more horrendous to show you images of eyeglasses, shoes, right? To let people infer themselves, right? To show some dignity to those who died, that the victims, like, instead of showing their bodies, we'll show all these shoes and you'll get the same impact, or eyeglasses or something of this sense, right? And so I had to wonder, like, how many lynchings is too much for me to show, right? And I sometimes watch the reactions of my students. When is it too much? And when does it trip over into exploitation? I don't always fully have those ideas, because on the other hand, I want to make certain that people understand that these things happened, that these were brutal and horrible things that happened, right? And that I want to show that here are the victims and here's what they suffered. I don't want to water any of it down, or take any of it away. And so I'm often struggling with those. And so so I have to always wonder, when it comes to fictional media, right? So I've already gone on to education. When it comes to fictional media, when is it too much? When does it cross over into some form of exploitation? Sometimes I can say it easily, right? If I'm watching, let's say, a Tarantino film, it's literally exploitation. Like literally that's what he's into, right? He grew up on blaxploitation. He loved Mandingo, by the way.
Exactly.
It was one of his favorite films. And so when you see his films, there's definitive is the exploitation of your senses, right? It's going to be more blood than is possibly in a human body. It's going to be over the top violence. That's understood. But what is it like when we're dealing with, more everyday things? And so, and I think it's something you said earlier. I call it almost the Dave Chappelle syndrome. At what point are we both viewing the same things? Right.
Oh yeah, that's a whole nother show.
That's the whole thing, right?
Well, I'm going to say when you brought that up, that's another show. Like when I watched that,
yeah,
half the stuff I know now I didn't know, so I view that show in a totally different way now than I did
yeah.
originally. Right.
Right. And so here, I'll take an example that's really brutal and it's harsh. Trayvon Martin, for instance, his body lying on the ground after he's killed in a hoodie has a complete meaning to people. It's mostly horrific to people, and yet other people use that image to teenagers and even grown adults to play a game, right? To pretend they were quote unquote Trayvon Martin and do this thing where they're lying on the ground in his body form. And so we see two different things there. And so as a creator, you wonder, are people going to do that with what I'm doing? Are they going to take away the horror and pain that I'm trying to express? Or are they going to dehumanize this person and think it's a game and it's fun, right? And so what responsibility do you have as a creator for that? And so Maurice is trying to deal with that in a sense, because in this case, the night doctors, they are exploitation, right? They're vampires in their own way who live for this misery, right? And so with them, she definitely knows, you're here to suck away my misery. You're here to use it to your own advantage. And she'll soon, as we know, so are the Ku Kluxes in a sense, right? They want to use that. And so for that, she's certainly like, no, absolutely not. And yet on the other hand, right, for those of us who want to document these things, I suppose in a sense what abolitionists did, taking from the Quaker documenting of suffering, right, where you document what happened, you write it down, and so you want you because you're using it as a way to persuade people. What is the fine balance there? And I don't always know.
Well, I'm about to say that there a lot again that you said.
Yeah.
Maybe we should just make this a whole like team talk class.
We should.
But I've questioned that. I used to show images of lynchings. I've gotten away to where I don't now, just for various reasons. And one image that I always show though is Reginald Marsh's this is our first lynching or something like that. It's from the 1935, and he was a white artist. It's from the NAACP's 1935, an art commentary on lynching, which it was sculptures, paintings, a bunch of different things that they exhibited to fight lynching, right? To call attention to it. And the image is a group of whites looking to the left of the canvas, and this little girl is on the top of two people's shoulders looking over there. You know that somebody's being lynched or burned off canvas. The faces of the people holding the little girl are really kind of grotesque in a certain extent. But the little girl sitting on top with the light kind of on her face with her finger, like kind of an inquisitive look, right? So you're inferring what's happening off page, but you're also seeing the effect of it on her. And to me, that's really a powerful thing, thinking about the impact of these things on whites, on me, on my kids. And then thinking about, and I do tell this one to my students. I don't remember who the individuals were who were murdered, but the lynching image with the whole crowd and the three white boys or two white boys, like, mugging for the camera, like smiling while the individual is hanging in the background. So those types of things I think are really kind of
the postcards and what have you.
Yeah. Right? And I was telling them that too, that these are forms of media too that are propagated and shared widely.
Yeah. I think what you say there is those dilemmas, right? Because on the one hand, like I would cut down on my lynchings, but then I remember looking at that silent protest march, right? The African Americans at the time, they displayed the pictures prominently. They blew up images of victims like Jesse Washington who've been burnt alive, and they wanted the world in some ways. And there's this, I don't know what to call, I sometimes call it this African American strategy of shaming, right? Sometimes shaming Americans, shaming the United States before the world to let them know you did this, right? And so they want these images to be shown. Ida B. Wells, when she would go to Britain to talk about lynching, right? The British would say, certainly those things you're talking about aren't true. And she had the postcards.
Yeah.
And she would say, really? And she would lay them out for them to see. Right. And so, it's again, this back and forth where, on the one hand, I don't, but I'm watching these activists who openly were like, no, they need to see this.
Yeah.
And so, but you make a good point. At what point is it too much? And but then you also point out, as you said, on the crisis, they do show that on the crisis, they could have easily put a lynching image up there, but they decided to go with this different version, right, of inference. I wonder how much they were thinking about how their own audience.
I think that's the only image. I looked through a lot of the pieces.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the only piece within that art commentary. I mean, it was an exhibit that doesn't show the victim.
Yeah.
There's one by Paul Cadmus that I really like, where you see the victim in the middle, and you see like kind of moves around a circle. You see three white faces, holding the victim down. But when you were talking to also
people, I guess what I'm saying, people, I guess what I'm thinking is people at the time were having the same conversation.
Right. Well,
yeah, we're thinking much the same way. Yeah.
When you were talking, I mean, also Mamie Till too, Emmett Till's mother. Mm-hmm. Look what you did to my son.
Yeah. 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 She wanted the world to see that. All right. And we all know it because of that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I also wonder, weirdly here, I wonder how much, I know that, I can't remember if they were successful, but I know the NAACP and others, they attempted to enforce laws that said you couldn't send this kind of thing through the mail to stop the postcards and all that from being sent. So I wonder if their own magazine, they couldn't put that on the front. I have no idea. I would love to know a 20th century historian who might know that. Like they couldn't put a direct lynching on the front because they themselves and others had argued. I can't remember if they were successful with the US government. Basically, the way they would try to like enforce the law, you cannot send images of death or so these kind of things through the mail. So you have to stop this. I wonder if I don't know. I wonder if that went into their thought.
I don't know. The last thing on that too that I thought about when we were talking, because you're talking about during enslavement. I mean, I'm thinking about Gordon, the image of Gordon that we see, with his back shredded. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I always think about Solomon Northrop's narrative. And one thing, and I noticed this even in the film. I mean, I have issues with the film adaptation, but the film and his narrative, even though he used an amanuenses, do something I think that's very important. And I even kind of think about Harriet Jacobs too. I think she does kind of something similar, but not in the same way. But there's always this beauty of the landscape or the beauty juxtaposed with the violence.
Yeah.
So not necessarily black joy, but just this pointing out of, because there's the scene where he whips Patsy. Mm-hmm. Where right before he whips Patsy, there's a discussion of the beauty of the cotton and the beauty of the field and the beauty of all this, and then the violence of what he's doing to her.
Right.
And in Steve McQueen's film, it's kind of these same things. You have these long shots of the Spanish moss with the cicada. The cicadas got on my nerves in that film. That's a whole other issue. But I mean, I live in the South too, but where you gave it. but these long shots of the Spanish moss of this gorgeous scenery, right? Mm-hmm. Juxtaposed against this violence. But I think that's an important discussion that we think about too.
And I think taking it back to Ring Shout, I certainly did by having like the shot of the juke joint. And I said I wanted to make certain that this wasn't all horror,
right?
Because it could easily come to it. I tried to put things in the juke joint. I put in a bit of humor where I could, juxtaposed against all this, because I said that's reality, right? And I think about, I'm old enough to one of my favorite hip hop groups for a while was Public Enemy, right? And we all know that while Chuck D and the rest of Public Enemy were very serious about their lyrics, there was a clownish figure that most people know because of the reality show now.
Yeah.
Called Flavor Flav. And the whole reason there was because it was like Chuck said, I'm hitting them with heavy things. They need something to balance that out. And I think that's life, right? Like none of these people who were existing all of these things, they were human beings. They weren't like going from one drudgery thing to the next. They were trying to think and laugh. They had arguments, and so I tried to embody that, for instance, with the characters in Ring Shout, that they aren't these perfect saints, right? But they're also not these downtrodden, victims completely, where, they argue with each other and they fight and they think about other things and they have sex and everything else is part, and they dance, and they eat food and they have all these other ways of communicating, and it's just, but they also have to live through this horror.
Yeah.
Right. And I always do that when I speak about, for instance, slavery. I would say, like, enslaved people were people, right? You have to think of them as human beings with all of the the great things and frailties, all there, all balled up. They argued, they fought, they laughed, they told jokes, they loved their children, they made mistakes, they did all those things. And I tried to get that across, even though ring shout taking place, of course, not during slavery, but that people can live under these adverse conditions and still try to hold on to their humanity in all its different forms.
And I think Marseille, Sadie, and Chef's banter back and forth, has some really good moments.
Yeah.
So let's end on this. I mean, I think the discussion's kind of led up to this. I taught ring shout a couple of weeks before my class started David Walker, Chuck Brown, and Sanford Green's comic series Bitterroot.
Yeah.
And at one point in that series, the white ally of the Sangarees, his name's Johnny Ray. And the Sangarees are a family of monster hunters who cure individuals infected with racism. And then in that novel, or that series too, Blacks or other individuals can become infected too, but it's the psychological effects of racism on them. So that's another issue we don't want to talk about here. But anyway, so Johnny Ray dies at the hands of Adro, who's the enemy, or who's the antagonist, I guess you would say. And Adro is an entity that reminds me some of the Grand Cyclops. And then when killing Johnny Ray, Adro comments on the hate and fear that's still within the white character. So he's become an ally to the Sangarees, but when he dies, and you don't see the hate or fear as he progresses in his journey towards allyship, basically, which is use that term. It's probably a better term, but for right now. But when Adro kills him, Adro says, "I taste the hate and fear in you." But then Adro says that there's something else that's there too, hope. So for all of the hate and fear that permeate ring shout, and hope remains. Yeah. Even when the Dark Prince, I had to look up who that was. It's Lovecraft. And that's one of the discussion of the that's one of the discussion, I think, of the continuation of media, right?
Yeah.
I'm right. Yeah. I'm right that that's Lovecraft, right?
Yeah. The Dark Prince of Providence. Literally, right. They named him that on his bust. Yeah.
Right. And I didn't know that. So I had to look. I was like, who is this? I kind of thought it was Lovecraft, but then it kind of makes sense.
Of course, ring shout owes its, there's a rebuttal is there to, if people know anything about Lovecraft and his really deep-seated racism.
Right.
Not slight, but he was
I haven't read Lovecraft, but there's a really good book, Bending Steel, Regalado, which talks about the impact of Burroughs, Lovecraft, and others on comics. And there's a really good chapter about Burroughs and Lovecraft talking about all of their issues. But anyways, so Adro tastes hope within Johnny Ray, right? So can you talk some about the hope we find within ring shout? And you kind of touched on a little bit.
Yeah.
And to end on this, why we need to always hold on to hope, which is a huge existential question.
I think I remember a version I read of the Greek myth of Pandora's box, where I can't remember which version. There's so many different versions, but one of them was that all the things that let out into the world, and the one thing that isn't let out, often people know, is the ability to tell the future. That was the one that Pandora meant to keep the boxes. That would just drive us all all mad. But there's also, I think, something else was let out as well. One good thing that was supposed to be hope. And I don't know if that was I don't know if that was like the more sanitized childhood version of it, but I always remember that, right? That hope was also let onto the world along with all of the terrible things from Pandora's box. But yeah, hope is what drives a story. I see do I see some Star Wars figures back there behind you?
No, those are all Marvel figures. So
they're just all Marvel figures?
Yeah, so there's Sam Wilson and US Agent, Moon Knight, Vision, Killmonger.
Oh, there's Moon Knight. I thought maybe it was one of those, I'll call them the Klan stormtroopers, the ones who are all white. That's Moon Knight, who's getting his own film.
Exactly. He's getting his own show. I'm kind of curious to see how it's going to go. I didn't. There's a whole issue with Moon Knight and kind of those early issues, I think. Yeah. I've been looking at him in the Black Panther. Because Christopher Priest has him show up in his run. So there's some really interesting things with Moon Knight. The new series is pretty good. The new comic series. Anyways, go ahead.
But yeah, and so, I was going to say with Star Wars from A New Hope, things like this, right? But the entire point in many ways is that resistance itself is its own form of hope, right? Like if there's no resistance, then what is there to hope for? Like the two come together. And so, the simple act that there is there are these people resisting. You see that Maurice and the others aren't by themselves; they have others, and they're all resisting against this. The simple fact that they're fighting back is what is great, right? That's the hope in itself. The simple fact that they find ways to live and love and do all these other things are also part of that hope. But even as they're fighting, they realize that in many ways, a lot of the battle is going to go on, right?
Mm-hmm.
The struggle isn't just going to be over. And I think when they ask the aunties, right, she's like, so if we do this, we win? And she says, no, we just get the chance to fight, right? Like sometimes getting the chance to fight is its own form of victory. And so, so hope is central to this entire thing, that people dare to hope, that they decide that they're not going to lay down and they're going to fight these things. And I think that's extremely important, because I think, that hopelessness and apathy, the two can go hand in hand, right?
Yeah.
Things are so terrible that I'm immobilized and I'm hopeless, or I simply become apathetic and I tune it all out and I don't want to deal with it. And all that does is it lets, the worst things simply fester and grow and continue to gain power. And I think that having hope that one day you can win, even if it's not going to be tomorrow, even if it's going to take a long time. I think about how many people had to have that kind of hope, and knowing what they were going up against during times when it may have seemed simply insurmountable, right? During these times of heavy anti-Black riots or during slavery or so forth. How do you think there's possibly going to be anything better? You have to have some kind of hope there.
Well, even the thought of hope that you may not experience it, but for the future generations that you have coming, right?
Right. Yeah.
I think about one of the things that I think about is the things that we want to see happen won't happen in my lifetime, probably. Maybe they'll happen to my kids, right?
Yeah.
But if you keep instilling that hope within your kids, and you keep instilling these things that are important that they need to know to lead to that hope, to that equity and that equality, then maybe it'll eventually happen.
There will always be somebody here to go blow up a movie theater.
Yeah.
Is
that
not telling people to go blow up movie theaters, but
is that the Inglourious Bastards reference, or is that the reference to?
That's actually a reference.
Birth of a Nation. I know.
That's actually a reference to Henry Monroe Trotter,
right?
The Black activist who is heavily. Actually, I think at one point he sets off smoke bombs.
Yeah, I did look that up after reading your book.
There's a riot afterward, and so that literally comes from that. But I hadn't even thought about the Inglourious Basterds reference. But yeah, it came from this notion of how do you destroy that movie and that image altogether. That was a symbolism.
And I've been meaning to rewatch that. I haven't rewatched it in a while.
Yeah.
But anyways, I still have Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, like in the shrink wrap. I watched it in the theater, and I had some real issues with that for various.
I haven't seen that one. The one, I haven't seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood yet. No.
I had
some on my TBW list.
I have some issues, but anyways, that's one other issue. Thank you for joining me today. It was a pleasure.
Great discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.